Joining us now for World Brief and the review of some of the headlines of today's newspapers from around the world is Adefemi Akinsanya. Good morning, Adefemi.
Good morning, Dr. Rubin. Good morning, Ayo. Good morning, Rufai. Good morning to you. Let's jump straight into our global review. So good to hear from you all, even though we are separated by distance. But let's get into our world brief. And we start, of course, with the Republican vice presidential nominee, J.D. Vance. Now, an audio has leaked via the Washington Post in which we hear J.D. Vance admit that the Harris swap on this ticket was definitely a gut punch to him. He made those comments in a very private fundraiser overnight, yesterday into today. And, you know, off the back of that, they have the Vance and Trump campaign have come out to say that, well, you know, they didn't actually discuss the content of that audio, but what they did say is that they are ready, of course, to take on Kamala Harris. Donald Trump himself spoke to Fox News. They also discussed, of course, this concept of this Harris presidency, the fact that she is likely to become the Democratic nominee. And he was also asked about whether or not he was going to debate her. And you can see him feel a little bit uncomfortable. He was stuttering a lot, falling over his words. And eventually he was nudged into saying, well, yeah, I probably will debate her. And then he went on to make comments about her age, saying that she's 60. Vice President Kamala Harris is 59. But essentially what the point he was trying to make was that, yes, she is far younger than Joe Biden, but she is still quite, quote unquote, old still. And that is something that perhaps the voters should take into consideration. So that was the latest that we saw between the Vance and Trump campaign. But if we move on to other parts of the world now, and we know that in Venezuela, protesters have headed to Miraflores, which is the presidential palace there in the capital, and they are there. These are the opposition voices protesting against Nicolas Maduro's declaration of victory yesterday. These are the supporters of the opposition candidate, and he says that their candidate Gonzalez says that he has won this election convincingly with a majority of 78.2% of the votes that have been counted so far. So police have been deployed, armed police have been deployed to the streets of Caracas and different areas of the Venezuela's capital because they're trying to avert a situation that could cascade into mass violence. This is happening, as we all know, against the backdrop of a country that has been struggling under this Maduro presidency. In terms of economy, you've got many Venezuelans over the years, especially under the Maduro presidency, leaving the country to neighboring Bolivia, to Brazil, trying to make their way into Mexico and then onward to the United States because of a desperate situation happening in the economy. Nevertheless, Maduro has proclaimed victory, and it will be interesting to see what happens there. And then lastly, if we come back to the African continent, Jacob Zuma has been expelled from the ANC. This has come off the back of findings of the ANC who say that the South African former president has been expelled from the African National Congress, the party he, of course, once led as president. And that's because he campaigned for the rival MK party during the 29th of May general election. And they say a sitting member of the party should not have done that. He has been given some time, I believe, some 3 weeks to appeal against its ruling. But it does stand, as it stands now, does show a lot of distance between the ANC and the former leader of the party and the former president, Jacob Zuma. So those are the three regions that we're looking at in this global brief. Please let me know your thoughts before we move on to the newspapers.
All right, real quickly, Femi. I hope what is happening in Venezuela is not going to be another case of what happened between Maduro and Juan Guaido, because that lasted for a couple of years. In fact, this was exactly what Maduro did. In this election, he prevented the person that had, the Machado guy that had a lot of gusto. The orator that ran against him, now he's declared victory when the other candidate is saying, oh, I also did win the election. Just like what happened with Guaido, he stopped Enrique Capriles from running then. Now, Guaido, that was the head of the National Assembly then, went after him, declared himself as president. They had two parallel governments. In fact, over 60 countries recognized Guaido. And that impasse went on for a while until that support waned and recalibration happened. So I just hope that's not going to happen to Venezuela again. And Maduro must remember that the Chavistas, those that supported Hugo Chavez, his political godfather, they've waned off because of the problems of the economy there. And isn't J.D. Vance such a gift that keeps giving? I love J.D. Vance.
Talking about J.D. Vance, so many questions coming up. Beyond the leaked audio, there are now conversations around his own age, since age has become such a big factor in this U.S. elections. Number one is that he's 39 years old, and the prospect or the idea being if he does become vice president, that he could, if anything happened to Donald Trump, become president, is a scary thought on both sides of the divide. That a man whom a number of people have said has little or no political experience, the conversation is he hasn't even run his own business. How will he run a country? And so it almost seems as if, Trump might have made an error in that particular choice. Let's see how that plays out and see if it would affect his chances at the polls in a few months' time.
Well, quickly, as for Jacob Zuma in South Africa, well, he asked for it. He's guilty as charged. He cannot be a member of a party, then form another political party, and then sabotage the ANC, given the ANC's worst record over 30 years. And now you have the MK, which he leads, being part of the party. His supporters have said this is a kangaroo ruling, but the ANC people are saying, well, you can't be in our party and you work against our party. Maybe there are lessons for Nigerians to learn from this particular example. The MK now has 58 seats in parliament, in the 400-member parliament in South Africa. If Jacob Zuma had not left, he probably would still be part of the party. He said he wanted to appear physically at the party headquarters, and he was told, no, not to come, so that he doesn't come to stage a movie. But in any case, that's the reality now. They say they've expelled him. They suspended him in January. In Venezuela, is Chavismo. We're having the effect again of Chavismo. President Maduro says he has won a third consecutive time in office. He's blaming the opposition in Caracas, in the state of Falcon, in Macale, as persons who are sponsored by the United States, as persons who are hate-filled. And out of his objection, they have expelled the diplomats from Nicaragua, from Honduras, from Cuba, from China. He's also blaming outsiders. There is an international dimension to it. 8 million Venezuelans have left that country, but at this time, we don't know where that many more will leave if Maduro is sworn in January. But Maduro is also protecting himself. If he loses out at the end of the day, he may go to prison in the United States because the Americans are looking for him.
Indeed, Dr. Rubin. There are many, many, many layers to what we're seeing in Venezuela. And notably, that is definitely one of them, trying to keep the United States at bay. Thank you so much for your comments. Let's take a look at some newspapers now. We begin with This Day here in Nigeria. And essentially what we're looking at is firstly a 48-hour countdown to go until the planned protest, with youths adamant that they will take to the streets, as well as calls for calm. And as well as that story, we're looking at the fact that the Tinubu presidency, the president himself, has directed the NNPCL to start selling crude oil to Dangote and others in Naira. Now, denominating these transactions in the Naira will reduce Nigeria's forex burden and save some $7.3 billion annually. And that's according to the FIRS boss, Dr. Zach Adedeji. So again, just leading back to what we've been discussing when it comes to Dangote refinery, it does look as though there is some positivity coming out and some collaboration between the refinery and the NNPCL. Let's take a look now at an insert, a weekly insert into this day. It's called The Lawyer, and it's a weekly pullout that comes out on Tuesday. And the weekly pullout looks at this issue going on with the Day of Rage is what it's called on the front page. The Day of Rage, it says, to hold or to not hold. And it's written by Ikepo Braithwaite. Her article looks at the limitations. She's focusing on the legal aspect of these protests. And her article, part of her article, looks at the limitations of the right to protests. And she says, her argument is that the freedom of expression, assembly, and association are not absolute. And she says that under Section 45 of the Constitution, those aforementioned freedoms can be limited in the interest of defense, public health and safety, as well as morality, or to protect the freedoms of others. So please do take a look at that pullout, that weekly pullout from this day, and have a read of the legal ramifications or an legal argument to what we're seeing as we count down to those protests. And if we now move on to the Daily Independent, they are again also looking at the protests, and they say that protests have already started in Niger State, and those protests were led by youths, and they gathered along the Kaduna Road in that state. And essentially, those protests were peaceful. According to this article, there were no issues other than the disruption of the movement of vehicles where they were gathering. And in response, local traders did close up shop as a preventative measure. But the reports that we're seeing is that those protests that we saw in Niger State were largely peaceful. Moving on to The Punch now, and The Punch is looking at comments from Nigeria's Communications Commission, who have ordered the restoration of SIM card activities, and that's as angry subscribers have been protesting these SIM card blockages, which were due to them not being linked to their Nigerian identification number, or NIN. And if we take a look at the Daily Trust, Interpol, the international police organization, say thousands of dollars are being laundered out of Nigeria every hour. Interpol's Nigeria chief says the situation is making Nigeria more prone to crime, and says that their Silver Notices initiative will make laundering of money harder. So they say. Moving on to The Nation, and that will bring to the end our last Nigerian paper. The Daily Nation looks at this minimum wage that has been signed into law by President Tinubu, this 70,000 monthly minimum wage, and it compels all employers to pay that amount. And that falls back to the Senate President, who've alluded to this fact that everybody is entitled to this 70,000 monthly minimum wage increase. And that, we were talking about Section 4 last week, so it does seem as though this applies to everyone. Now, if we move on to our African papers, in Ghana, the Daily Graphic takes a look at the fact that 15,200 nurses and midwives will be recruited into the health facilities across the country. And that's after the Ministry of Defense granted clearance for their recruitment in a probe, or in a move rather, that has been described as an election gimmick. As you know, Ghana is going to the polls in a general election in December, the 7th of December, and critics are saying that the government is doing this just as an election gimmick rather than actually wanting to empower and employ nurses and midwives across the country. Then if we take a look also at the Daily Nation of Kenya, they are looking at government's expenditure wastage. They say that 54 billion shillings of Ruto's budget has been wasted. And their analysis of government expenditure shows that William Ruto's directive to state agencies to slash huge allocations to hospitality, travel and other overlapping roles has contributed, or rather is a result of those wastages. Then if we take a look at the Financial Times is looking at the UK Chancellor Rachel Reeves and her unveiling her so-called, incredibly tough choices that she has to make to plug this massive hole of £22 billion. She's calling it a fiscal hole, and says that she's going to have to fill that hole by raising taxes. And then lastly, quite a sad story on the front page of many UK newspapers, but we'll take the front page of The Guardian. The Guardian is looking at the fact that 2 children are dead and 9 people are injured in a series of knife attacks at a dance class in Stockport in the northwest of England. Those are the stories I have on our global newspaper review.
Well, thank you, Adefemi Akinsanya. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Otherwise, I would have loved to comment on the president saying now the Dangote refinery and other local refineries can get crude oil directly from NNPC Limited. I think it's a rational decision. I think it's wise. But the thing again is, where would this crude oil come from? Dangote, 650,000 barrels. The Nigerian-owned
the supply.
refineries, 450,000. And yes, we have OML 11, 25, 26, OML 42, OPL 245, lying idle. I think that the president has to go beyond this symbolic decision to say, look, those OMLs and OPL, particularly in the MPDC in the Benin zone, should become productive. And operatorship rights should be handed over to the private investors, you know, so that you can get the crude oil. Dangote didn't ask for payment in dollar. He just said, give me crude, allow me to sell at market price. But there are consequential steps to be taken. I think the experts in the industry, the Dankunles of this world and others, can advise the government appropriately.